So at the end of October, we had that expansion pack go live for the Nintendo Switch Online service, added Nintendo 64 and Sega Genesis games, and we also had controllers that were introduced by Nintendo, certainly tugging on the nostalgia heartstrings there with the Nintendo 64 and Sega Genesis controllers being introduced. I wasn't that interested in the Sega Genesis controller because it seemed pretty straightforward. However, the Nintendo 64 was such an interesting time in Nintendo's history, introducing things like the analog stick that, I had to get this so we could at least check it out here on the channel. Guys, if you enjoyed these videos, make sure that like button helps out a ton. And if new here to the Spawn Wave channel, make sure you subscribe down below. So first things first, let's take a look around the box. This is a very basic box, by the way. We have the kind of the plastic window here looking right at the front of the controller. Nintendo Switch Online, N64 controller down here. Nothing on either side. Nintendo on the top, nothing on the bottom, and just a brief overview as to how to plug in your controller, charge it, or you can also plug it into the wall, it looks like. So either the console or the wall, that'll work. And it does explain pairing, where you have a little sync button at the top. But that's pretty much it. We'll open it up now and take a look. I do have an original Nintendo 64 controller here that's actually in pretty good shape overall. Didn't go through the torment of playing the original Mario Party and just absolutely destroying the analog stick. So it should give us a pretty good comparison, I think. So we have the box out there. Then we have our controller. Let's get it out of here. There's not much else. I think we have a we have a cable, okay. So we have the USB Type-C cable. Again, very happy that everything Nintendo's doing now is just USB-C. Significantly more convenient than a standard USB like micro or mini cable. And there's our Nintendo 64 controller. So let's take a quick look around here. A, B, start, C buttons, D-pad. Ooh, the analog stick feels close. That is really, there might be a little more tension, although the original one I have, it's a little old. So there's a good chance that just over time it's become slightly looser. This feels pretty good. We have Z on the back here. The thing that's really funny though is they had to pretty much cover up what would normally be a spot if you look at the original, where you would put in a rumble pack or a controller pack for saving a game or experiencing the next generation rumble at the time, which is how they were pretty much playing it up. And it was pretty cool. And now we have rumble in basically all of our controllers. And you know what? Let's just get these side by side here. Nintendo did a very good job recreating the original Nintendo 64 controller now in 2021. Just like looking around them, the dimensions are like just about dead on. Obviously, the only difference being that backing there. And it looks like the buttons have a nice similar feel, nice click to them. C buttons are good. Yeah, wow, if you just wanted to kind of go back in the past and see what it's like to buy, I guess, a brand new one. Even the D-pad is like spot on. The big question mark is gonna be this analog stick, obviously, because that was one of the big failure points for the Nintendo 64. It was an earlier time in 3D gaming. Obviously, we had just made the jump to it. And Nintendo showed up with this weird thing called the analog stick. It didn't make a lot of sense when we first saw it, but then they presented it with Super Mario 64 and everyone's mind was just blown because you would pick the controller up and it would make sense to play that game. Although, I will say this, if you hand someone the controller now, just like this, you go, here, hold this, I feel like people are gonna be a little confused. In fact, even in Nintendo's own advertising, they hold it like this, whereas usually you're gonna end up holding it like this. And I think that's one of the reasons that people look at this as one of the ugliest controllers, because there are 3 handles, but we only have, 2 hands. So like, how do you hold this thing? Well, if you're playing a wrestling game, you'd hold it like this because this is how you would move your character around the screen. This would usually be for special move. But if you're playing a game like a Mario 64, like a GoldenEye, you'd be holding it like this. So you have access to the analog stick and of course that Z button. Now there are some weird things with Nintendo and their switch for controls around the Nintendo 64 games on that online service. And obviously the controller should remedy that because it should match up perfectly. We'll play a few games here just to make sure that is the case. But you can kind of see it and be like, okay, yeah, I guess that would be a little weird to just by default come up with a control scheme because so many games use so many different buttons in different ways on this controller because it was such a strange thing at first. And I guess it kind of still is, but that's one of the reasons I mentioned that it was a big deal for Nintendo if they would just add in the ability to customize controls for those Nintendo Switch Online expansion pack games. Anyway, I just paired the controller right here. It does show up with a nice little Nintendo 64 icon, and I do like that they have little buttons colored, like we have red, green, blue, yellow. It's kind of a fun touch there. So I guess we'll back out and we will jump into the Nintendo 64 app. Also, I did get some initial feedback with the rumble just now when I paired it, and it feels like kind of the older type of rumble, like what we would have in like the PlayStation 4 or Xbox One, I guess even series controllers. Like, I don't think this is advanced haptic or HD rumble that we have here. Anyway, I'm going with the classic here, obviously. The one that started it all with Nintendo and this analog stick. Going with Mario 64. Just gonna jump in here to kind of the beginning portion, run around a bit. Yeah, I mean, the thing with these games in general is there is noticeable input lag for some of the games, like Star Fox, I think is the best game on this service right now. Ocarina of Time is the one that certainly has issues, but I do notice it at times with Mario 64 as well. But this does feel pretty good. Here's an issue though. For some weird reason, this does not have rumble. You have to have the Japanese version of this game, Mario 64, for it to take advantage of the rumble in the 64 controller, which is a bit weird. But again, this is Nintendo's online, and I feel like we say that a lot. They have a couple of extra buttons up here. We do have ZR, that is how you suspend. And then we also have home and snapshot. So we can take snapshots with it, which is great. And then we have our USB Type-C charge port here. So let's go ahead, hit suspend, and we're just gonna go back to game selection. And I wanna go into Star Fox 64 because obviously we should have access to rumble there. So I am getting some feedback with the rumble. I mean, it does remind me a bit, obviously, of playing this back in the day on the Nintendo 64. It's, like I said, it's not the accurate rumble that we've had with the Switch. Thanks, Slippy. But like, for example, right there, I could feel a Slippy running into me. At least the rumble was activated there. And it is reminiscent of having a rumble pack, for example. It's kind of that violent rumble. And as I mentioned before, Star Fox is the most responsive game, at least that I found. When it comes to these Nintendo Switch Online games for the 64. Some of them have more input lag than others, but Star Fox seems pretty clear of it from what I can tell. Now, the biggest thing here is obviously doing the boost and barrel rolls and the loops and all that you can do with the C buttons. It's so much easier now using this controller over that Switch Pro controller or the Joy-Cons, because it is a little hard to get used to that way, whereas this is it's more muscle memory since I have access to the C buttons right here, just remembering what we used to do, you know, back in the day when we're playing multiplayer or if we're in any of these all range mode battles with bosses. Now I'm just kind of running around in Ocarina of Time. So we were talking about input lag with this game specifically. This is one that keeps coming up. And what I decided to do was before I did this video, I sat down, I played a little bit of Ocarina of Time, just started a new game with this original controller on an actual Nintendo 64. It still doesn't feel as bad as this. Like, I think people forget that we were dealing with quite a bit of input lag even back then. But like this is more noticeable than on that original hardware. Again, it's more familiar with this controller now, obviously, because we're not remapping buttons. In fact, what's really funny is if you go to the suspend menu and then you press up to look at your button configuration, all it does is tell you capture, home, and suspend because, well, everything else is right there in front of you and already mapped up. I just hope we get to a point where Nintendo has patched and worked on this a bit more to where we have access to these 64 games in better working order. I'll say just a better experience with the game, because this controller, Nintendo did a very good job recreating this, keeping kind of the same spirit alive with the original, but then also bringing it into kind of modern times, making it wireless, built-in rumble, and USB Type-C charging. Well, now that we've had a chance to try the controller out, we're just gonna go ahead and open it up real quick, take a look inside. The regular 64 controller, the original one, wasn't that complicated inside, even though when it came out, it legitimately looked like alien technology. But I thought it'd still be interesting to look inside and just see what Nintendo may have shifted around or changed. So the first annoying change is that we have tri-wing screws all over the back, whereas with the original, I think they were just Phillips head screws. Yeah, so they were just Phillips head screws all the way around. I think the ones at the top where that controller pack slot is were smaller. All right, so the back comes off after the screws come out, and all my buttons just fell out here and I caught them. And then we have the original Nintendo 64 controller right here. It looks like the Z button stays with the backing for the original, whereas here it's actually hinged inside. And obviously at the top here, we can see we have the slot for the controller pack, whereas we do not have that here. Instead, they just decided to essentially pack in the rumble pack. Like that's what we have here. And this is indeed one of the older style rumble motors like we've had before in the PlayStation 4, Xbox, all of that. So it is not using that HD rumble, which it doesn't really need it if you consider how basic the rumble was in those Nintendo 64 games. To mimic that rumble pack, you do need a very large and violent rumble motor, not like the more finessed motor that we have in, for example, the Pro Controller, the Joy-Cons. The motor also just plugs in, so that's pretty easy to remove, and I am noticing more plastic in this controller, most likely because it's not like this big thick board that we have in the original. Now they probably had to add at least some support by having this plastic in behind the main board. We also have our sync, home button, and snapshot up here. And this kind of reminds me of what's on the Joy-Con railing, actually, of the 4 LEDs and buttons. So we do have 2 windows. We have this, which is our main cable running to what I believe is on the other side of this, just a board. And then we also have a power plug right there that needs to be disconnected. It looks like this lifts up, and then it's still kind of connected at the top, which would be for our main strip up here with those LED lights. So that'll get unplugged. And it does house our battery. Like our battery is right in here. It's still a plug-in battery, and it looks like it is, once again, basically the same battery that we have in our Joy-Con controllers. That does make sense. I mean, why would you use different batteries and have to produce those when I'm sure they have plenty that they're making for the Joy-Con? Why not work it into the 64 controller too? And now you can sort of see why they opted to add that extra plastic, because the main boards look a little different, right? A little smaller here. I mean, on the other side of this is mostly just like kind of ribbon cable material, if you will. Like it's not a thick board or anything. So they had to use that plastic just to make sure this wasn't an easy controller to just kind of bend around and flex. This is our main board. We can actually see our antenna at the top here. Good place for it. It's essentially where you're not really gonna be putting your hand over or anything like that. The D-pad looks pretty good. It has that nice spike in the middle there. Like I said, it really reminds me of this 64 D-pad, so I feel like Nintendo did their best to be as close as possible to it, but it does look like you're gonna have a nice pivot in the middle, so you shouldn't have that many like mispresses or anything. But obviously the thing that people are very curious about is going to be this joystick. And I can already tell that it's a different plugin, so you wouldn't be able to use any of the replacement joysticks, at least easily. I feel like you could wire a new one up. I think Bob did that from Wolf Den. I don't think I would recommend that because obviously Nintendo doesn't have that in mind with this newer board, and it's not gonna be something that you just plug in. So unfortunately, this isn't going to be something that is easily replaceable if it breaks, at least not at this time. What I would like to see Nintendo do, the thing is these are gonna be kind of limited anyway. Like I don't think they're gonna be putting these all over the place. You have to go through their online store. What I'd like to see them do is just release this part on their Nintendo store, because they do have a place for refurbished and just parts that you can buy. So maybe they get to a point where they just put these out if they have extra ones left as they continue to produce these. So if this is broken, I mean, it's actually pretty easy to get to this point and just unplug and plug a new one in. Also, opening up the analog stick is pretty easy. They just have 2 clips, and then they have a single black screw on the other side that holds it together, at which point you can take the bottom off and get a good look at the mechanism inside. People were mentioning it's all plastic, and yeah, it is. So sure, over time, you could have it wear down. These little teeth inside, for example, could start to chip, but we've kind of known that for a while with the Nintendo 64 controller. It's never been the most sturdy analog stick, which is why you see so many replacements sell online, and unfortunately, they just never feel great. Again, I think it's a good idea for Nintendo to look into selling these as replacements, because yes, people are going to be rough with these, especially if we get like the original Mario Party or something dropped on the Nintendo Switch Online. That would probably be mayhem. And a lot of times it will happen over time as this gets worn down. You also have like plastic shavings inside that can throw off the dead zone of it, and then it just becomes wobbly in general. So unfortunately, it still looks like this is something that could be prone to all of that in the future, but I guess we'll see how this holds up and if Nintendo is open to releasing this part specifically. It's kind of a shame they just didn't go with the same plugin, but maybe they had something else in mind with this board and they weren't able to accommodate it exactly. But I will at least give Nintendo some credit for this, because clearly they did their best to remain as true to the original 64 controller as possible while adding in some modernized features, especially when it comes to the build quality. I mean, just looking at it inside, this is a well-built controller. It's not junk, it's not cheaply built or anything. Like, they went a bit further with this than even I was expecting, just kind of looking inside. Now, with all that said, all the praise about the build quality of the controller, the original feel, should you be running out and trying to find one of these? Well, I'm gonna say probably not, at least not right now. These things are sold out until 2022, according to Nintendo's website, which means you'd probably have to go to the resellers market where they are marking these up pretty heavily, and there's just not a ton of games that you're gonna be using this controller specifically for, at least not right now. I feel like a year from now, for example, you could see many more 64 games on that service, and it might be worth picking one of these up because they should be back in stock, I would assume, by then, as Nintendo does still sell the Super Nintendo and original Nintendo controllers quite a bit. So as of now, unless you desperately want to get hit with just massive amounts of nostalgia because something you remember from when you were younger, I would kind of hold off on this at least until we get the next batch of 64 games. Then we can kind of gauge how many exactly are gonna be added in every update. And in the meantime, hopefully Nintendo does add remapping for like the Pro controller or Joy-Cons in that Nintendo 64 application, because as of now, this is the best way to play those N64 games, at least from a controller standpoint. But let me know what you guys think about the Nintendo 64 controller that Nintendo themselves have now released in 2021. Thanks guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.